Okay, good evening from London, everybody, from the Radical Anthropology Group. A special welcome to people who haven't come to the Radical Anthropology Group before, and Happy New Year to those who have been following our classes. We've been doing classes on a Tuesday evening, right for like 40 years, in fact. And they've been mainly inspired by the work of Chris Knight, who's speaking tonight, on his work on the origins of human culture. And I'm going to flash up Chris's book here, Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Human Culture. And a number of us connected to radical anthropology have been kind of continuing with research, the models that he originally was proposing. But perhaps the radical aspect of the Radical Anthropology Group is that we try to bring together biological and social and cultural approaches to have a holistic viewpoint on human origins. Now, rather cheekily, this term we have given ourselves the title, The Real Dawn of Everything. And this is our response to the book which Chris can flash up, The Dawn of Everything, by the late David Graeber and David Wengrow. And this is a book which is, well, I think it's given everybody a lot of things to think about. So we found it in equal parts very inspiring and also infuriating. Inspiring because it has kind of opened up all these rafts of questions, got people talking about the stories we tell ourselves about human origins, tried to take perspectives that are much more indigenous than, Eurocentric. But on the other hand, for us, we've been working away at human origins for decades. In fact, between us, we would have more than a century of research on the subject. We're also a little bit sort of angry about it principally because it is very, it has kind of left Africa completely out of the picture. And with a new history of humanity, you really can't leave Africa out of the picture. So in trying to respond to the book this term, we're letting Chris off the leash with several talks. He's going to be presenting some of RAG's theories and models, and he's also going to be drawing on a lot of indigenous mythology. It's something that we often do in the spring term of RAG. We do intensive study of mythology, and Chris is going to have about 3 cracks at the grammar of mythology. In addition to that, myself, I'm going to be doing some work on Hadza stories, and one of our ex-students, Ivan Tacey, is going to be doing work on Batek Malaysian stories. And we also have Denise Arnold, very distinguished anthropologist of Bolivian Andean cosmology, going to be looking at Andean cosmology and astronomy through the medium of women's songs. And that's a really beautiful talk that's right at the end of this term. Other contributions include Jeff Hughes, who's done very contemporary anthropology in the Middle East on Jordanian marriage, the crisis of marriage in Jordan. So we wanted to have more attention to the Middle East currently. We also have Duncan Stibbard-Hawkes to help us with this approaches to African archaeology by study of African hunter-gatherer material culture. What can we actually expect in the archaeology of our speciation over about 200,000 years ago if we consider material culture of African hunter-gatherers? And further to that, a very special lecture by Heidi Gertner-Abendroth, which is happening on International Women's Day, March the 8th. She will be talking, she is really the grandmother and matriarch of matriarchy studies. And she will be talking about matriarchy and what matriarchy may tell us about the key question that Graeber and Wengrow have been asking, which is in their book, which is how we got stuck. I think Chris will be talking a little more about that. question, how do we get stuck in this very rigid inequality and hierarchy, because we don't believe that is normal or natural for humans in our ancient past at all. And we also have a very young, right at the opposite end of the spectrum, from Heidi, who's a real grandmother, great grandmother, I think, a young scholar, Gabriela Kunterides, who's going to be working or presenting her research for the first time on premenstrual experience, both ethnographic and quantitative research on premenstrual experience. This is, you'll soon find out that menstruation is something that we're very interested in, and both physiologically and cosmologically. It really kind of crosses over the bridge between biology and culture in many, many ways. So we have myth, we have marriage, matriarchy, menstruation, and many more things that may help us to throw light on this key question of Graeber and Wengrow. How did we get stuck? So Chris is going to start off on that, on women's resistance sparked the human revolution. Off you go.
Okay, well, this has always been, in addition to those things that Camilla mentioned, we've always tried to make this into an introductory course for people who just want to know about anthropology. And so I always feel it's a good idea to begin at the beginning and say that anthropology addresses just one question, only one, but it's a very big question. What does it mean to be human? And of course, there are different ways of approaching that question, but here at UCL, the Radical Anthropology Group are basically at University College London. Here we address that issue from a number of different angles, which actually is quite unusual, because most institutions where you study anthropology will just be doing one of these things. But here at UCL, we address the question, what does it mean to be human, by asking, for example, what might it mean to be a creature, a primate, in fact, a great ape, extremely intelligent, involved in politics, maybe a gorilla, maybe a chimpanzee, but not quite human. Just as, of course, from their point of view, we're not quite gorilla. And we think here, I certainly think this is very true, that it's difficult to get an angle, a kind of leverage on what it means to be human without working out, in addition, what it might mean to be pretty closely related to humans, but nevertheless, rather definitely not, certainly not cognitively and anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Another way, of course, is to look into the past and ask what it might mean to be an Australopithecine or Homo erectus or a Neanderthal. So as well as looking at different species closely related to us, we can also go back into the past, and we do that here at UCL as well. We have, we do archaeology and go, including Paleolithic archaeology. And then finally, of course, there's the traditional social anthropological approach, which is to get again a perspective on what it means to be human by asking what are the many different ways there are of being human, the many different ways there are of respecting the sacred, of caring for children, of organizing sexual relationships. And that's so important, because to be scientific, of course, we have to escape our own particular cultural assumptions. And it's just, too often we think it's kind of natural for a child to have one mummy and one daddy, whereas, of course, hunter-gatherers have a system, almost all of them, of classificatory kinship, where a child has many mothers, many people who the child will call mother, and who will act as if they're mothers towards that child. In particular, I have always been approaching these questions from the point of view of Darwinian gradual evolution. How do we gradually become, as other species gradually become, what we are today? But in particular, exploring the idea that evolution was not only incremental, not only gradual, but in our case, culminated in an immense social, sexual, and political revolution. So I've been exploring this idea that evolution culminated in revolution, the revolution that actually made us human. I'm going to mention some of the debates about exactly when and why this happened. But in RAG, we mostly agree that there was such a thing as a human revolution. Somehow something turned the world upside down and gave us these strange things which define our species. So one of the reasons why we were fascinated by, and yet at the same time, as Camilla said, kind of infuriated by this wonderful book, which is a wonderful book, it really is, everyone has to read this book, is that it's got such a misleading title. It's called The Dawn of Everything. And we think it should have been called something like The Tea Time of Everything, because it starts very, very late. It starts 30,000 years ago with the beginnings of different social differentiation, privilege, ruling elites, class. About 30,000 years ago, when we get what is too often called complex social organization. And so if you're interested in that, if you're interested in history, there's some wonderful speculations, some intriguing ideas, and lots of enormous value in this book. But if you're interested in how we became to be creatures with the kind of eyes we've got, they've been described as cooperative eyes. Our eyes are very different from those of our great ape relatives. They're two-way eyes. We don't try to use our eyes aren't designed to prevent others from knowing what we're thinking. They're transparent. The way in which the dark iris is set against the lozenge-shaped white sclera is designed to give away information about what we might be seeing. So we humans have a number of anatomical, physiological, psychological features. And of course, a critical one is language. Language, in the case of our species, it is, as Noam Chomsky quite correctly pointed out many years ago, it's part of our nature. It has often been called instinctual. Every child is born with a kind of language instinct in the sense that the architecture of the child's brain kind of knows in advance roughly what a language is. And of course, the grammar of a language is a hugely complex theoretical structure. And for the brain to kind of know in advance what a human language is and to learn, its natal language so quickly and so creatively, there has to be something already in the brain that allows it to do that, because certainly chimpanzees have no such language acquisition capacity, as it's technically called, or language instinct. It's very, a chimpanzee you can sort of drum into it a rather rudimentary form of American Sign Language or British Sign Language, but it doesn't take to it with any appetite. And so that's a critical feature about us humans. But of course, we laugh, we sing, we can see ourselves as others see us. We've got what's called intersubjectivity as part of our cognitive makeup. All these things really, they're just extraordinary, in addition, of course, to our really outsized brains, which we're going to be talking about in a moment. So these features are so extraordinary that something rather extraordinary must have happened during the course of human evolution. They're clearly, in some sense, revolutionary, even if they took many thousands of years to evolve. And we're very interested to find out what that might have been. So we're saying the dawn of everything goes back a long way prior to 30,000 years ago. And in fact, what we call the human revolution got underway perhaps 500,000 years ago. And the dates obviously are a bit difficult because it would depend quite what we mean. But anyway, that order of antiquity we need to go back into rather than just 30,000 years ago. Now, I mentioned language, and this isn't going to be a talk about language, but I did want to start out with some absolutely magnificent paragraph from David Graeber, because it captures in a very attractive and immediately intuitively appealing way what I think is the background to the origin of language. The anthropologist Pierre Clastres, an anarchist anthropologist, described language as the antithesis of violence. Where you have violence, you're not going to get language. if violence is a way of getting making your way in the world, if you use violence in order to ensure that those around you do what you kind of want them to do, you're not going to, language isn't going to evolve under those conditions. So let me just read out from David Graeber, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, page 72. Beautiful writing here. If you have the power to hit people over the head whenever you want, you don't have to trouble yourself too much figuring out what they think is going on. And therefore, generally speaking, you don't. Hence, the surefire way to simplify social arrangements, to ignore the incredibly complex play of perspectives, passions, insights, desires, and mutual understandings that human life is really made of, the surefire way is to make a rule and threaten to attack anyone who breaks it. This is why violence has always been the favored recourse of the stupid. It is the one form of stupidity to which it is almost impossible to come up with an intelligent response. It is also, of course, the basis of the state. Now, that is absolutely wonderful stuff. And I don't know quite what's happened to my, oh, here we are, yes. Wonderful stuff. And it's rather different. Why is this silly computer doing ridiculous things for me here? Rather different from what we get in this book, where we're told that the state has always existed, and the state is as old as religion, unless, of course, this book is arguing, which you never know quite whether they are arguing that or not, that right from the very dawn of history, humans have used violence to establish their rule or to get their own way in the world. So, we need to look at the roots of violence if we think that in order to get to a point where language could begin to evolve, violence had to be set aside in some sense. So let's just ask ourselves a bit of a question here. What are the roots of violence in humans, but also in our primate relatives? And what I think is pretty obvious as soon as you think about it is that sex is somewhere in there. I think all of us would know that when people start, a very large number of murders are over sexual jealousy. And when we look at our primate relatives, you can see very, very quickly that the most intense fights break out between baboons or between chimpanzees or between gorillas when sex is involved. And of course, what happens with primates, as with so many other mammals, is that the males compete violently against each other to gain access to females. And very often, the females in turn collude with that by selecting as their sexual partner the male who proves most aggressive and most effective in using violence to get his way. And it's pretty clear that in order for that kind of dynamic to move over to a more peaceful, tolerant, easygoing social dynamic, the females have got to make moves. What would have to happen is the females would need to start selecting males on a different basis, maybe on the basis of their helpfulness or their commitment or their usefulness in provisioning food, helpfulness in tolerantly looking after babies even when they know they're not their own babies. I mean, those are the kinds of things which will have to play some part in producing either a great ape society or an early human society where violence was largely set aside. Obviously, you can't completely get rid of violence; it's always going to be there. But if violence is the main method of settling things, then it seems, as Graeber was saying, very unlikely that language could possibly thrive or flourish under those conditions. Revolution. I mentioned earlier on that I think that evolution culminated in revolution and gave rise to forms of social organization where, to a very large extent, thanks to rules and regulations surrounding sex, but for example, the incest taboo is the most familiar and obvious one, violence was to a large extent set aside. So that would mean, if that's the case, that early human society was essentially non-violent, at least internally, and relationships were egalitarian. There was conflict, inequality, sexual inequality, differences between males who do have access to sex and males who don't. All those things would be minimized. And that would lead us to try to look at different human societies and work out what makes them today more or less violent. So perhaps I should just mention, because Camilla talked about the radical anthropology group going right back. We're definitely London's longest running evening class. One of the ways in which we defined RAG, the radical anthropology group, was to say that we do reverse anthropology. And what we mean by that is we're recognizing that anthropology has a colonialist background. And when in the post-war period, in the second half of the 20th century, colonialism began to be overthrown and set aside in favor of other forms of exploitation and dominance, mostly by the West, of course. What happened was you got an emphasis on what used to be called, perhaps it still is called, development. So the idea was that you do anthropology to help develop undeveloped societies. And so just to make a quick point on that one, I certainly think, and I think everyone in RAG thinks, that development is a good idea. And in the West, we certainly could do with some development. We need moral development, social development, political development, and we can learn a lot from other societies on that score. And we call it reverse anthropology because we think the people who might help us to develop on those levels might be societies that, which, for example, are not patriarchal, where women have an equal amount of say and power and respect in society as men. And essentially, hunter-gatherer societies, or certainly what James Woodburn, the pioneer specialist in hunter-gatherer studies, called immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, those who don't practice storage. They are extraordinarily, not simple, but complex societies. There's nothing more politically complex than maintaining an egalitarian way of life. And so our view is that hunter-gatherers can teach us a lot. And to use that language of development, yes, they can help to develop us. So I now want to do go back into the history of anthropology, and I'm going to pick on one particular extremely influential anthropologist who happens to have been probably the major influence on David Graeber. His name is Marshall Sahlins, and he died just a couple of months ago. It's hard to think of a more, if you like, senior anthropologist than Sahlins, and it's often forgotten that he began, I won't say as a sociobiologist, but he certainly began as an anthropologist who was very interested in the social lives of monkeys, apes, baboons, and humans, and was interested in how the social structures and dynamics of non-human primate societies, monkeys and apes, may have developed into early human society. And one of the reasons for choosing Sahlins is that he completely broke through what is now regarded, I think, by pretty much everybody, the ridiculous and utterly foolish idea of social evolutionism, the idea of a ladder of stages from, for example, savagery through barbarism to civilization, a 19th century idea of steady progress, which put chimpanzees far down that ladder, hunter-gatherers not too far up the ladder, and then Victorian man at the very pinnacle of civilization. And what Sahlins did so brilliantly in the article I'm going to talk about now was just turn that actually upside down and argue that hunter-gatherers are in so many ways further removed from non-human primates social dynamics than most other societies. In other words, there's a huge gap, and in fact a bigger gap between hunter-gatherers and chimpanzees than there is between Western capitalist man and chimpanzees. The argument being, of course, that we, like chimpanzees in the West these days, are not at all egalitarian. We have huge inequalities of wealth and power, huge amounts of conflict. In our world today, violence is most definitely a means of sorting things out, much more influential on a global scale than languages. And so what I want to do is to root my own theory of human origins in this precedent, because it is true that when I was beginning my thinking about all these things, Marshall Sahlins was the first anthropologist whose work I read, and it was like scales falling from my eyes. I thought, right, okay, this is extraordinary stuff. It was a beautiful article in the Scientific American, 1960, by Marshall Sahlins, and if I'm up to it, I'm going to see if I can share screen. This is Marshall Sahlins, The Origin of Society, Scientific American, 1960. And you notice here on the beginning of this article, a picture of a troop of baboons. And here, the next picture is a photograph of Kalahari San Bushmen. So, is this social evolutionism? Do we have stages, steps up the ladder, from savagery through barbarism to civilization? Wonderfully, Sahlins is making a very different point. So you could be misled. You could think, in this article, Sahlins got baboons on one page, and on the next page, he's got photographs of hunters and gatherers. What's he doing? Is he making comparisons between baboons and hunter-gatherers? Well, no, he certainly is not doing that. And I've just circled the critical paragraph there, and the next one should have that's okay. So this is Sahlins' comparison of primate sociology with the findings of anthropological research immediately suggests a startling conclusion. The way people act, and probably have always acted, is not the expression of inherent human nature. There is a quantum difference, at points a complete opposition, between even the most rudimentary human society and the most advanced subhuman primate one. The discontinuity implies that the emergence of human society requires some suppression rather than a direct expression of man's primate nature. Human social life is culturally, not biologically, determined. So Sahlins is setting up this opposition between nature and culture. And he's not one of these thinkers that thinks, if it's natural, it must be good. Let's follow nature's way. He's really saying, when it comes to certain things, particularly sex, non-human primate nature, if we were involved in societies based on those principles, we wouldn't feel at all happy. And we need culture to shape things in ways which nature alone can't. Human social life is culturally, not biologically determined. And then the decisive battle between early culture and human nature must have been waged on the field of primate sexuality. Now, I was reading this, I think I must have been, 19, 20, 21, and I thought, this is getting very interesting and very, very persuasive, that sex must have been at the center of the conflicts and dynamics which led evolution towards revolution. The decisive battle between culture and nature must have been waged on the field of primate sexuality. And now he explains his thought. Sex is not an unmitigated social blessing for primates. Competition over partners, for example, can lead to vicious, even fatal strife. It was this side of primate sexuality that forced early culture to curb and repress it. The emerging human primate in a life and death economic struggle with nature could not afford the luxury of a social struggle, could not afford the luxury of a civil war, if you like. Cooperation, not competition, was essential. Culture thus brought primate sexuality under control. More than that, sex was made subject to regulations, such as the incest taboo, which effectively enlisted it in the service of cooperative kin relations. And the next sentence gives you the reversal. Among subhuman primates, sex had organized society. The customs of hunters and gatherers testify eloquently that now society was to organize sex in the interest of the economic adaptation of the group. Well, in that previous paragraph that I just read out, competition cooperation, not competition, was essential. Culture thus brought primate sexuality under control. You can see there's a bit of hand waving there. It's not very, very clear what exactly it is that got culture to bring nature under control, or natural sexuality under control. Apparently because it was essential, but just because things are essential doesn't mean they happen, of course. We need to know what are the mechanics of that transition. And I think it's true to say that the nearest we get to it is the next little bit I'll read out. Culture is the oldest equalizer. Among animals capable of symbolic communication, the weak can always collectively connive to overthrow the strong. So basically saying that if you have a baboon system, he's mostly talking about baboons because in the 60s, not very much was known about other primates in the wild. Among baboons, it's pretty clear that the males fight each other to control the females, and alpha male ends up pretty much on top. I mean, I'm simplifying somewhat, there's all kinds of much more complicated things going on. But the point being made here is that wherever you have dominance, you have resistance. When an alpha male dominates everyone else, some of those who are being dominated will form alliances to resist the violence, the harassment, and so forth. As long as they can communicate with each other in some way. And so he's arguing here that if you've got an effective means of communication, then the weak can combine to resist the depredations of the strong. And of course, mostly, not always, not with Madagascan lemurs, but mostly with primates, the weak or the weaker tend to be the females, because females usually aren't quite as good at one thing, namely violence, as the males. So there is a sort of hint here that possibly the weak meant females resisting by forming alliances, being dominated by males. And then here's the final page of the article. Notice on the left, small Kung girl grooms somebody else. Okay, this is the passage which was sort of like a ringing revolutionary declaration to me when I read it. In selective adaptation to the perils of the Stone Age, human society overcame or subordinated such primate propensities as selfishness, indiscriminate sexuality, dominance, and brute competition. It substituted kinship and cooperation for conflict, placed solidarity over sex, morality over might. In its earliest days, it accomplished the greatest reform in history, the overthrow of human primate nature, and thereby secured the evolutionary future of the species. By the time I was reading this, I'd already become pretty hostile to what the Americans were doing in Vietnam and all sorts of other things going on in that period. And I was already thinking that the only solution to the world's problems is some kind of egalitarian revolution. And so when I was thinking that, I was reading this line, the greatest reform in history, I thought, looks like Marshall Sahlins is kind of equivocating here. He probably means a revolution, but he's describing it as the greatest reform in history. Whereas I was thinking to myself, well, actually, I think it must have been a revolution, and probably the greatest revolution in history, certainly the one revolution that we know actually worked. And of course, the next little part of that sentence, the overthrow of human primate nature, overthrow doesn't, to me, sound like reform. It sounds like overthrow. And so having read that, I've spent actually the rest of my life pretty much as an academic trying to make sense of this article and trying to make the argument work. Because it was fairly clear to me that simply saying culture turns up and rescues us was insufficient. Why on earth would culture do that? All sorts of things wrong with that formulation, apart from the fact that chimpanzees have culture. Culture means, technically, it just means inheriting patterns of behavior through learning down the generations instead of through genes. So, I mean, most mammals have culture of one sort or another. What was different about this form of culture which produced these revolutionary effects? So in 1989, we had everything started to come together. This was Chris Stringer, Paul Mellers, and others. There's a massive volume called The Human Revolution. At that stage in the late 80s, the human revolution was thought to have occurred around about 40,000, 30,000 years ago as modern humans began moving out of Africa. And then quite a bit later, I think this next on the right, they're Rethinking the Human Revolution by Paul Mellers and others, and Chris Stringer. By that stage, thanks partly to the work of RAG's own Ian Watts, the world's #1 ochre specialist, and that's a picture of that ochre there, everyone started rethinking the human revolution, so that instead of the earlier idea that somehow we evolved in Africa but only got smart when we hit Europe, sparking the Upper Paleolithic revolution, it was now pretty clear that the dawn of everything, to use another term, was Africa, and that Africans were already fully cultural, fully symbolic, fully sophisticated, with very complex egalitarian social systems long before anything interesting was happening in Europe. Africans got there first. So that's where we are today, and we're still kind of working out some of the details of that revolution. In that sense, the human revolution was took much more time, but still, in the end, the world was turned upside down, and that's my definition of a revolution. It doesn't really matter too much how long it takes, as long as eventually, by the time that revolution is consummated, the world has been turned upside down, roughly in the way that Marshall Sahlins was saying, instead of sex dominating society getting it together to control sex. Now, very tragically, in my view, very tragically, something happened in 1976. So before these works on the human revolution came out, Sahlins gave up on the work he'd previously been doing, and helped, in my view, steer a very damaging wrong turn in the whole of evolutionary anthropology, and really the whole of anthropology, because he noticed that the people who were doing the kind of work he was doing in the article I've just been describing were very often right-wingers, which of course you'd expect. You'd expect right-wingers to try to use whatever they can to support their positions. And he noticed that people were using studies of monkeys and apes to buttress their idea that you can't change human nature, that males will always dominate females, that competition, selfishness, private property, whatever it is, possessiveness, individualism, they're just the way things are, and you'll never change human nature. And because some sociobiologists, as they began to be called, people who are biologists but were interested in social life, just as Marshall Sahlins was, of course, just because some sociobiologists made statements which seemed a bit uncomfortable, suddenly nearly all the left followed Marshall Sahlins in denouncing anyone who was a sociobiologist as some kind of racist, sexist, fascist, and the rest. And it was not just unfair, which it was extremely unfair, because as I perhaps mentioned, I mean, one of the targets of all this was somebody called E.O. Wilson, who died a few weeks ago. And I remember at the time thinking, well, E.O. Wilson, I've read his book, very interesting. He's an insect specialist, a specialist in social insects. And I just thought to myself, I thought fascists were keen on intimidating and targeting Jewish people and Black people and perhaps beating them up. Why would a fascist think it was a good idea to spend his whole life in rainforests studying social insects? There's something slightly weird about all this. And then I began to realize that just about everybody in the world who was doing any serious study of baboons, of dolphins, all the people that David Attenborough, you watch a film on any part of the world, Green Planet, any other part of the world, all the studies being done were done by people who worked out the new genetics termed sociobiology. In other words, the study of animals, not simply in terms of their instincts and their anatomy, but in terms of their social relationships. But the left followed Marshall Sahlins in damning that entire field of wonderfully exciting and interesting study as a thing called sociobiology, which is sort of intrinsically, according to these people, kind of evil, politically incorrect and evil. So one of the things which E.O. Wilson said, and I remember reading it and thinking, why is he talking about this? He said, woman's place is in the home. And I mean, E.O. Wilson was an insect specialist. He had no right to say anything about what on earth woman's place was, whether the home or anything else. Already I knew quite a lot about hunter-gatherers. I was quite aware that actually the camp is the home for hunter-gatherers, then it's the place to be, because it's where all the discussion takes place, all the singing, all the power, all the relationships, all produce, forage, all the meat which men hunt in the forest is brought back to this collective home. It's the place where collective childcare takes place. So apart from anything else, women's places in the home is, if you mean the kind of home you have in the West, an isolated, privatized place without much power, then of course it's a rather strange assertion. But I mean, E.O. Wilson, writing this book called Sociobiology, he just innocently popped in this rather reactionary and stupid statement, and everyone jumped on him. So in the home, or what is woman's place? I mean, that started to be an interesting question. And Sarah Hrdy was actually the one sociobiologist. She still calls herself a proud sociobiologist, a Darwinian feminist. She's the one of those founding figures in the science of social biology or sociobiology who had any right to talk about primates or humans, because primates were her specialized topic of study. And I'm going to let Camilla in a moment talk a bit more about this. But in effect, what Sarah Hrdy said was, no, not women's places in the home, women's places on the picket line. Now that's my term, the picket line. But if you just think in terms of women's place is to resist being oppressed, is to withdraw cooperation from unhelpful males, to form alliances to resist oppression. And if you think that that kind of withdrawal of cooperation is some kind of strike action, then there's no question. Sarah Hrdy was saying women's place is on the picket line, and Camilla's going to explain that in a moment. So let's just move through this a bit more. Here are the figures. Many of, I mean, it's hopeless doing this because it's always so unfair. There's so many other figures that I haven't got pictures of up here. But on the left is Donna Haraway, and she wrote this extraordinary book, Primate Visions, about the politics of primatology. In other words, the politics shaping how scientists study non-human primates. It's a marvelous book. I really recommend anyone needs to read it. But among other things, which is absolute genius, she realized that sociobiology was an absolutely liberating development, because in the past you had a thing called group selection. And the idea was that the female of the species, the female baboon, the female chimpanzee is tagging along because you need her in order to have babies. And what's important is to work out what the dominant male is doing, because he's dominant, and therefore he's going to be deciding things. And clearly the female or females tagging along aren't too interesting. So the female was sort of grouped alongside the dominant males before sociobiology, before and this new version of Darwinism. And what Donna Haraway realized is that as soon as you use the new method, instead of group selection, you have individual selection, and each individual is designed by previous evolution to get her or his genes into the future. Suddenly you disentangle things, and you realize that the female has got her own autonomous strategies, very often in conflict with those of the male. And suddenly everyone was interested now in female primates and of course female early humans and female humans today as independent agents with independent agency, often absolutely at loggerheads with the agency of males. Then the next along is Adrienne Zillman, and she was absolutely furious with the ridiculous emphasis on chimpanzees, as male-dominated chimpanzees as kind of model for early humans. People like Richard Wrangham, actually, who still to this day thinks that we are chimpanzees and behave the way we do with patriarchy and all the rest of it, because that's in our nature, because our ancestors must have been rather like common chimpanzees with all the violence and male dominance that they have. And she was actually the first evolutionary theorist to realize, even before studies in the wild had been done, that the bonobo was much more likely, that's another kind of chimpanzee, very much closely related, about 1 million years separated from common chimpanzees, but she was the first person to realize that these men were using chimpanzees to sort of buttress theories of male dominance, man the toolmaker, man the hunter, man the thinker, all these various things. And we really needed to look at this other species of chimpanzee, the bonobo, in order to get a much broader picture of the possibilities. And she suspected that actually bonobos are actually not necessarily genetically closer to us, but behaviorally and cognitively very likely to be a better model, not a perfect model, but a better one. Then moving along, Sarah Hrdy. I mean, she now is, she's, you know, like some of us, like me and others, we're kind of slowing it down a little bit, not publishing quite so much, but she's the senior figure in biological anthropology, I would say. And she's the architect of the main theory of human evolution, which is the theory of the babysitting ape. The idea that what makes us different from the other great apes was the fact that human females from a very early period could trust one another sufficiently to hand over their baby and ease the problems of childcare. I'll let Camilla talk about that. Then a little bit to the right, we have Amy Parish. She was, again, a major figure in saying that actually these sorry, okay, but Amy Parish was, I mean, she is, but she was the first person to stress that bonobos are matriarchal. That's the point I'm making. So the idea that we need to sort of model ourselves on common chimps, which are very patriarchal, she was among the first to stress the other way around. And then we have Kristen Hawkes down here, who the source of what's called she's doing a bit of grandmothering there. She's the source of the grandmother hypothesis. I think Camilla can talk about that. We have Leslie Aiello, who's come back here now after a very distinguished career back to UCL. Camilla next, and I've got down here Camilla's grandmothering in female coalitions with Kit Opie and first gender wrong sex. And then furthest on the right, Zana Clay, who's another author who wrote in the Radical Anthropology Journal an article on bonobos called Bonobo Girl Power. So I'm going to ask Camilla to come in now.
Okay, so really, Sarah, I mean, I'm in slightly exalted company there. Sarah Hrdy and Kristen Hawkes can be understood as the matriarchs of human origins studies today, and between them, they have really turned human evolution studies to a very feminist trajectory. At least if they didn't call it feminist, it's a trajectory that is very much from a perspective of female strategies as the leading edge. And then that opens the window to understanding children's strategies as the leading edge for human evolution and ultimately what you say, revolution. Now, I'm not quite sure if Sarah Hrdy would call females on the picket line exactly. That would be pushing it a little bit. But her first work, the most famous thing what she got famous for in the first place was on female langur monkeys, her study of langur monkeys, which showed that female langurs were very much troubled and had to resist the risk of infanticide by males who came into troops. And that was when she got this picture. She started seeing females that might be a mother with a daughter trying to gang together to defend tiny infants from males who were coming into the troops and wanted to kill the infants because they wanted the females to be ready to mate so that they could mate those females. So this was kind of an image of the opposition to male violence of female moral solidarity. And Sarah didn't exactly put it like that, but it was evidently what was happening. Sarah focused on the ways that many types of monkeys and apes, but particularly langurs, they used their sexuality to fool males to make sure that they could confuse males about paternity. Because if a male thinks, if a female has sex with a male and the male thinks he might be the daddy, he's not going to do anything nasty to the infant. So it may pay those monkeys, those female monkeys, to have sex with lots of males. So this leads to a female kind of use of sexuality for strategic ends. So this was one of Sarah's first contributions, the woman that never evolved. Taking it chronologically, we then have the major contribution by Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues, James O'Connell and Nicholas Blurton Jones. who first of all generated the grandmother hypothesis, other colleagues, Eric Charnov and Helen Alvarez as well. The grandmother hypothesis. Now, this arose from work with the Hadza, hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, where I've also had the chance to work. And with the Hadza, they were observing that actually Hadza hunters only occasionally, like once a month, had a good kill. But so what were children actually living on? You know, if they only had these big kills of meat occasionally, what were children actually living on? And they were observing how hard the mothers, maternal grandmothers or maternal relatives, older relatives, became known as hard-working grandmothers. They just went out, dug roots all day long, brought back all kinds of food that could feed particularly the very hungry weanling children, the children who are no longer on the breast, whose brains are growing at a very strong, very fast rate at that age, and who need a lot of energy, not just once a month, but every single day. So this developed into the idea of the grandmother hypothesis. And with Kristen Hawkes, she was developing it as an idea to explain life history of humans that are menopause. You know, why do humans have such a long post-reproductive state? That it may pay mothers to start to help their daughters and look after their children, especially the young weanlings, and to therefore help their daughters start having children more quickly, another child more quickly. This really challenged all the people that Chris has been mentioning, the people like Richard Wrangham, people like Rob Foley, who assumed that humans were just some other kind of chimpanzee, that we've always been patriarchal, always been male dominated, that males have always tended to live with each other. Instead of that, well, with the Hadza, you get a situation where mothers live with daughters very frequently. Certainly for the first period of a daughter having children, she's going to be living in the camp with her mother. That picture that Chris showed of Marshall Salin's article with the Jeune Croix hunter-gatherers had a lot of young men sitting around the fire, and those young men are all sons-in-law. They are men who come to the camp to do bride service and work for their brides and give meat and supply to the in-laws. They aren't taking their brides away. They are coming to where the woman is, and she is living with her mum. So this is much more characteristic for African hunter-gatherers. And the grandmother hypothesis was absolutely challenging the idea that, oh, female, male relationships have always organized and dominated human societies. It's with hunter-gatherers, this is just not true. Okay, and back to Sarah Hrdy. So the grandmother hypothesis was arguing that really the first social division of labor was a coalition between a mom and her mother helping to take on extra childcare, giving the mother support of extra childcare. Now, Sarah Hrdy was looking at the grandmother hypothesis. She was a little unconvinced because she still thought basically hunter-gatherers had patrilocality, that women moved to where the husband was. But she began to realize that was being undermined, that whole idea was being undermined. And then she was really interested in explaining this whole question of what makes us different from great apes. Why are we are great apes, we humans, we're great apes, but why are we so different from the others? And Chris has mentioned some of the evidence in terms of our cooperative eyes. The fact that we, with the mechanisms like our eyes, we are willing to look into each other's eyes and let each other know what we're thinking. What are we interested in? What we're looking at? We do mutual mind reading. So Sarah Hrdy's great recent book is called Mothers and Others, The Evolution of Mutual Mind Reading. we mesh our thoughts with each other. We want to understand the point of view of each other and let each other understand our point of view. And great apes really do not do this. Their eyes are dark, their eyes are round. They don't want each other to know what they're thinking, partly, not even bonobos this, partly because, and mainly because, they live in very, what are called Machiavellian societies. They live in societies with a great deal of cooperation. And if you need to hustle to keep ahead, to keep ahead in terms of rank and status, you can't afford to tell other people what you think and what you feel and what you want to do next, because it's part of the hustle, it's part of the competition. Even though they're very socially intelligent animals, they're still Machiavellian intelligent. They don't do this thing that we do, which is known as intersubjectivity, allowing each other to read each other's thoughts, wanting to know what's in each other's heads and minds, hearts and minds. So this is the basis for Sarah Hrdy of what she called emotional modernity. And she tried to work out the evolutionary context of this, what makes us emotionally modern, what makes us willing to share our thoughts with each other. And she placed the context for this in a matrix of cooperative childcare. So she just imagined a situation where a mother gives her baby to another, so mothers and others. So mothers, in order to get some relief from the enormous effort of looking after a large-brained primate offspring, gives her child to another person to look after. Now, in the first place, that person is likely to be female because it's part of a female coalition, not likely to be a male. And that person is likely to be a relative of a fit. So from a mother's point of view, probably her mother. In other words, Kristen Hawk's grandmother. So first of all, maybe it's grandmother and daughter with a child. If the mother hands over the child to the grandmother, then you've set up a very strange situation from a point of view of great apes, where each of those parties, the mother, the little baby, and the grandmother or the carer, the other carer, are checking each other out. They want to know what is in the minds of each other, and they want to show what's in their own minds to each other. The little baby wants to know where mum is, wants to look at the carer and find out how the carer is going to treat, wants to babble and make themselves really lovable and get lots of attention. So you've suddenly got a situation of a triad where everybody's trying to communicate what's in their minds and find out about what's in the minds of the other. Now, what Sarah Hrdy said is that with great apes, even bonobos, whether it's gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, this never happens. It just doesn't happen, because a mother holds onto her baby for dear life. She doesn't let her baby go into the arms of another. The principal reason for which is that in the case of great apes, they're nearly always, the female has moved out of her natal group and gone to another group, and she has no female relative close to her. So she doesn't have somebody that she can absolutely cast iron trust to hand over her baby to. The only times you will see this with great apes is when they are in a zoo situation, a captive situation, where unusually you might get females that are related close to each other. And in that situation, it changes. And there are some interesting examples from chimpanzees in the wild where females have stayed with their mothers, and that changes an enormous amount. So this builds up to a picture that in human evolution, somehow mothers must have been living with their mums. And this is underlying the emergence of our intersubjectivity. It's underlying the emergence of our life history with menopause and post-reproduction and grandmothers. It's underlying the emergence of childhood itself. And above all, it supports and underpins the emergence of our incredibly large brain sizes. Now, strangely, neither Hawkes, Kristen Hawkes, nor Sarah Hrdy argued their kind of setup, the evolutionary setup for this extraordinary level of childcare and so forth, and this socialization of childcare. They didn't use it to argue the increase of our brain size, but others since then have, including myself, but also people like Karen Isler and Carol van Schaik, have shown that it is completely impossible for a mother alone to raise an offspring with a brain size larger than about 500 or 600 cubic centimeters for a grey tape. And basically all the other grey tapes, plus the Australopithecines, seem to be under what is known as a grey ceiling. They basically have not been able to get above a certain brain size because the mum is a single mum doing all the work by herself. She has to nourish that child with its very expensive brain tissue by herself. And they're just basically constrained. What happened in human evolution by about 2 million to 1.5 million years ago is that we completely bust through, like Homo erectus, bust through that ceiling, so that we had twice a chimpanzee brain size with about 1.5 million years ago. And then subsequently, within the last million years, 3 times a chimpanzee brain size. We've got an extraordinary increase of brain size going on in the last stages of human evolution. And the only possibility for how did mothers have the energy and the capacity to raise, not just to raise these very large brain children, but to have children stacked up. They have children 2 to 3 years apart, only possible with cooperative childcare and grandmother help, or other carers help, including, of course, gradually bringing males into the equation, and males as part of those cooperative childcare coalitions becoming domesticated with intersubjectivity, reducing all those aspects of violence that Chris was talking about. So both Kristen Hawkes and Sarah Hrdy have completely revolutionized the perspective on human evolution, looking through from the position of women and position of children. And we can say, and from my own experience with the Hadza, what hunter-gatherer camps really resemble, particularly African hunter-gatherer camps. They are like machines for cooperative childcare. That is how those camps operate. That's what they are. With collectivized childcare, collectivized food sharing, and that's what they do. That's what they're designed for. Is that enough?
Thank you. Done it far better than I could have done. So brilliant. We've pretty much finished, but what I'd like to do is, if I could, I want to mention one more brilliant female anthropologist, and it's Elaine Morgan. Those are bonobos, and I'm now going to the real dawn of everything. I'm going to the earliest hominins. The definition of a hominin is that it's a great ape that walks on 2 legs. And what happened is that some common chimpanzees about 1 million years ago managed to cross the Congo River to the south side, where they found an absolute paradise of abundant food, including all these aquatic resources and the semi-aquatic resources. And you can see that they're walking upright. And you have to, once you're in the water getting this wonderful food, first of all, you've got to walk upright, otherwise your nose is under the water. And secondly, you're buoyed up by the water. And so it's just so clear. And Elaine Morgan is just one more figure, female anthropologist, whose treatment by the male establishment was absolutely shameful. She was just hounded and ignored and ridiculed, as if somehow she'd suggested we were once dolphins or whales or something. Nothing of the kind. She was trying to explain some of the unique features of the hominins, including bipedalism. And I just want to end with the fact that whilst completely ignoring Elaine Morgan, the same Richard Wrangham that's been going on about how chimpanzees are, the model for early humans, this same Richard Wrangham with Dorothy Shaner's, Robert Seyfarth and another colleague, they've actually ended up supporting Elaine Morgan's theory. Shallow water habitats as sources of fallback foods for hominins. In the thing I've read, I've circled there, this study differs from traditional savanna chimpanzee models of hominin origins by proposing that access to aquatic habitats was a necessary condition for adaptation to savanna habitats. It also raises the possibility that harvesting efficiency in shallow water promoted adaptations for habitual bipedality in the early hominids. I'm just saying that without mentioning Elaine Morgan, in fact, without mentioning me or anybody else who's been supporting Elaine Morgan for the last 30 or so years, Richard Wrangham has proposed that the first hominins began walking upright because they were semi-aquatic. And he towards the end of this article, I won't go on too much longer, he says this is still the savanna hypothesis because he defines savanna. His version of savanna isn't the hot, dry savanna of the earlier sort of man the hunter ideologues. His definition of savanna is its riversides, lakesides, shorelines, waterside, all the rest of it. He defines it as savanna in order to be allowed not to mention Elaine Morgan, in my view, absolutely scandalous. Having said all that, just to get back to the main point, Camilla's finished off the story more or less. I mean, there's a lot more to say, but the human revolution was led by females, and it was the revolution that worked. We know that it worked because here we are with our two eyes, our capacities for laughing, singing, seeing each other as the other sees, and perhaps above all, our capacity to agree on rules for behavior, including, of course, rules to shape and sometimes control that part of our lives which is very difficult to control, namely our sexual urges and instincts, to actually have what's called kinship, formal kinship, in other words, certain rules against abusing your mother-in-law, against rape, and so on. That was a remarkable achievement, and the idea that the incest taboo was invented by males, which is of course Levi-Strauss's idea, simply does not square with modern genetically literate Darwinian theory. If incest has got problems and it's damaging, it's the female who suffers much more than the male. And so it's pretty clear that whereas with chimpanzees, females often, and that is one of the reasons why, of course, female chimpanzees need to move out away from their home and move away to have sex, is because they're trying to get away from their brothers and fathers trying to have sex with them. Any Darwinian who thinks about how the incest taboo might have emerged cannot avoid the conclusion it must have been female strategies which established the incest rule, but also all the various other rules, which we call kinship systems, which regulate sex. So just to finish, the revolution has made us human. That's the one revolution which worked. We know that it worked because here we are. We did it once. Let's hope we can do it again.
We're going to hear about this revolution next week, yes?
Well, I haven't gone into the critical factors, which, of course, what exactly was it happened and how do we know, which are going to involve things like menstrual synchrony, the Oka record, female cosmetic coalitions, and various other interesting topics. So yes, watch this space.
Yeah, more next week.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. You want to come out of the screen? Great. And I'd have a view. So we've had quite a few questions and thoughts in the chat. So please, anybody who'd like to intervene there. And any questions? Anybody with comments or questions? Can raise your hand or just wave at me or just come in. Let's see what we had a very interesting points. Sutinder and Amajit were talking about Indian traditions and how mothers will return home to their mothers who may be married away from their mother's home, but will return home to their own mother's home with a new baby. And that is very interesting.
When do they do this?
Just start, well, Sutinder, can you say anything? Or they're saying when a woman has given birth. And I know that also is true with Himba women as well. Either the daughter will go to the mother's, or the mother will come to where the daughter is. And it's very, very important. After birth for 6 weeks. Thank you, Sutinder. That's great. And Amajit is saying that pregnant women would go to their own mother's home for giving birth.
Well, I need to know which areas. I mean, it can't be everywhere in India. It's a huge place.
Well, it may be many places. Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Punjabi for sure. That's the answer. Thank you. That's really interesting. North India. Yes.
Yeah, perhaps say something I didn't say, which is that there is and Camilla sort of mentioned it. There's this assumption by nearly all primatologists that we are great apes, and therefore we are what's called male philopatric. We are great apes, and therefore the females have to move away when reaching sexual maturity. And in fact, as Camilla was saying, with hunter-gatherers, immediate return hunter-gatherers is not the case. And the brilliant thing is that I've always known that. It just makes nothing else makes any sense. But quite recently, at a conference in Liverpool of the Hunter-Gatherer Research Conference of Hunter-Gathering Research, we had a whole bunch of geneticists who spoke to us, and I remember holding my breath because they were going to tell us whether there's findings on long-term genetic studies, MIT DNA versus nuclear DNA over many generations of farmers and hunter-gatherers in Africa. Which way round it was? Does it show that over the thousands of years, or at least over many, many generations, women have been living with mum, living with mum, living with mum, or is it the other way around? They've been living with their husband. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, if the result comes out wrong, everything I've been working on all my life is wrong. And thank goodness we all sighed a huge sigh of relief. It turned out that for a very long period, whereas with farmers, women have to move out to where their husband is and stay with his family. In other words, with their in-laws, including their husband's brother. With hunter-gatherers, women have been living with mum, living with mum, living with mum. Matrilocal residence, which again is so satisfying because it's something which Lewis Henry Morgan and Frederick Engels were arguing long ago, but which throughout almost the whole of the century, of the 20th century, has been denied. They've all been saying that matrilocal residence doesn't work, and anyway, we're great apes. So that's another extraordinary turnabout, a discovery. And even today, most of the people like Robert Foley and Wrangham people, they don't want to know about it. They suddenly decided they're not so keen on genetics now. Now it's come out. Now the answers have come out wrong.
There's one question pertaining to that. Is Dan Glazebrook. I don't know if you want to say anything, Dan, just asking about Engels, how this relates to Engels' Origin of the Family, and of course Lewis Henry Morgan before Engels. You want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, can you? Yeah, I just started reading the Engels, so and that was obviously just when you're talking. Well, two things stood out. One, the savagery, barbarism, civilization, unfortunate stadial view that he kind of reproduces, but then also the matrilocal stuff. So I was just kind of wondering, how it fits in, really. Nothing, just sort of generally any comments on what sort of stood the test of time and what hasn't. You've already started to answer it, but yeah.
I don't think Engels' version of the stages was that bad. I mean, it was part of the sort of, Victorian idea of progress, and almost anyone more or less sort of had to go along with some version of it. But I mean, none of us would defend, the ridiculous idea of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, that kind of ladder these days. Unfortunately, in this book, The Dawn of Everything, the authors conflate modern Darwinism with this evolutionism, if you like, and they say they don't like the evolutionism, and so they don't like Darwinism either, and they won't do Darwin, and they don't, and David Graeber says he prefers Peter Kropotkin, which is nice. I mean, I'm quite keen on Kropotkin, but I mean, there's a reason why not a single dolphin specialists, elephant specialists, giraffe specialists, anyone that studies any creature in the wild that uses Kropotkin, because if you assume that cooperation is natural, and that's it, and if you can't actually explain why in certain cases you don't get a lot of cooperation, you get, for example, male infanticide, and in other cases you do get cooperation, your theory isn't too useful. So just saying cooperation is everywhere, mutilators everywhere isn't helpful. But just to answer your question, what's extraordinary is that that side of Morgan and Engels, which is that the earliest human families were essentially based on a matrilocal residence pattern, and therefore a bias towards matrilineal descent in opposition to patrilineal descent, doesn't mean clans, but it means a certain emphasis on the female line that has come up trumps. And it's much to the embarrassment of pretty much all anthropologists of the 20th century after the First World War absolutely insisted one way or another that that was nonsense, and that the nuclear family and all the patriarchal extended family were the, if you like, original forms of family life. So Engels has been very much vindicated, but nobody wants to know about it because it's all a bit embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, Engels has some horrible bits where he's talking about brains sizes and trying to infer superiority on basis of that, and all of that stuff is completely out of date and long past it, and just, you know, don't even think about it. It's just wrong. But Engels has these brilliant insights about primate sexuality and the what is it, the jealousy of the male as what keeps the primates in cooperation, but comparison, humans are able to overcome that jealousy and create situations of actual exchange of sex, of not just economic exchange, but sexual exchange, and this is a very revolutionary insight into the sort of thing that Marshall Sahlins was later talking about. In some ways, Marshall Sahlins was following the tracks of Engels quite markedly, without admitting to it, it should be said.
And by the way, it's absolutely standard sociobiology, or standard, and just to mention to people who aren't sure about all this, these days most sociobiologists have decided to change their label. They call themselves behavioral ecologists or evolutionary psychologists or some damn thing, so just to avoid being shouted at. But it's standard behavioral ecology that female primates, actually female mammals, drive social change. It's what the females do which determines, in other words, whether the females disperse or aggregate as they're foraging for food, you know, or whether they're up in the trees or down on the ground. Where the females are determines where the males are, because for the males the priority is sex, whereas for the females the priority will be how do they feed their offspring according to the resources in the environment. So it's just normal, absolutely normal, that females drive any major change. So it's just, you would expect that such a huge major change as becoming human, becoming egalitarian hunter-gatherers, you would just assume that females must have driven that. And yet, you know, once again, I'm afraid politics seems to get the better of people. And suddenly, the very people that have been inventing those theories, like Richard Rauger, they suddenly decide to forget them when it comes to humans and go back to patriarchy because it's where they're at politically. So it's very unfortunate the way politics interferes with science. I'm very much in favor of a connection between the two things, but it should be the science which comes first and informs the politics. When the politics is first, it's always absolute rubbish. Keep politics out of it, unless the science is on top. So, I mean, this is all fairly still rather controversial, and so there must be lots of arguments and controversies and discussion and different points of view, which hopefully, I mean, I never really quite asked. I mean, we call this the real dawn of everything because we were sort of assuming that a lot of you at least would have read this book, which is a lovely book in so many ways, and it's certainly opened the door, because it's so widely read and reviewed and praised. It's opened the door to exactly the issues we're now discussing. So I don't know, is there any discussion on that? Has anyone else read the book and come up with ideas and thoughts? Ian, you need to unmute.
In a sense, I precisely because of what you said at the beginning about it restricting itself to the last 30,000 years, in order to avoid engaging with evolutionary theory, it doesn't engage with anything you've been talking about.
No, it doesn't, except they take issue with the one theory of the human revolution, which kind of works, which is Christopher Boehm's theory, which is that, and it's in Hierarchy in the Forest, it's very well read, you know, kind of mainstream argument, which is that wherever you've got dominance, you're going to get counter dominance. The counter dominance is going to be in the form of coalitions. And according to Christopher Boehm, the origin of sexual morality, religion, kinship, language, everything which makes us human, was that the subordinates banded together and formed a coalition so big, again, like a coalition against alpha males, that it became a coalition of everybody. Well, in this book, they do actually take issue with it, and they say, well, hang on a bit. If they had a what's called reverse dominance by Christopher Boehm, they said if they were continually establishing reverse dominance and they stayed in reverse dominance, that would mean they got stuck. But surely humans would never want to be stuck. If they're free and creative, they would want to choose oppression and violence, harassment, brutality just as often as freedom and equality. And they just say hunter-gatherers are no more likely to be egalitarian than farmers, cattle herders, people that live in empires, and so on. So, I mean, it is quite extraordinary that they take that view. So they actually do take issue with the human revolution in the form of this book. I mean, our theory, my theory, obviously they don't want to even mention it in case other people, get to know about it, which is very sad. I mean, I was actually politically a very good friend of David's. We got on very well. We never had any arguments at all. But for some reason, he seemed to think that we in RAG were primitivists, and decided that primitivism, in other words, he seemed to think we all wanted everybody to go back to bows and arrows, which is not really what we want. I don't think anyone in RAG think we ought to go back to bows and arrows.
So why do they bother engaging with Boehm?
I think because they sort of recognize they kind of had to do something along those lines. I mean, they even engage with the ochre, Ian. I mean, they sort of mention one or two beads and finds of ochre while dismissing the significance of those things. Yes, I mean, so they feel they've got to better sort of mention one or two things, and then in order to pass off without being accused of not mentioning it. I mean, I can't quite say they didn't mention the ochre, because I think a couple of times they sort of did mention it. But so I mean, yes, it's a strange. I mean, actually, this book, The Dawn of Everything, I'll just say this, is nowhere near as brilliant and beautiful a book as Debt. I mean, Debt is a wonderful book. I would say everybody absolutely has to read that. There's some wonderful stuff in there, including, by the way, it's about money, but one of the lovely things Graeber says is that, have you noticed that all these beads and forms of camwood and cosmetics and stuff, and have you noticed that all the bits of silver and gold, what they are is they've got no use whatever except as adornment on the body, the bodily adornment. So it makes, so the first money is attached to the body, if you like. And those are wonderful insights, really interesting. And also he makes all sorts of lovely points about, about exchange and barter. Just pointing out that gift giving is the source of all these exchanges. The idea of, I've got some yams and you've got some meat or something. Let's make an exchange. Is all not. I mean, the whole book is beautiful. Although there are again things which all of us can debate. But I think this book is nowhere near as exciting and interesting. Although there's some lovely stuff in it. But I mean, it's a shame if people don't read these things. I know if once you start saying there are things wrong with it, it's perhaps people will think, well, I'm not going to bother to read it, but I'm not sure that's. I mean, it's very readable. It's very well written, and it kind of gets the blood up, because when they say things, I mean, they turn Engels upside down. They say in the beginning was religion, private property, and the state. That's the core message of the book about the dawn of everything, which is an astonishing position for an anarchist to take, because it's the idea that, you know, it's the position which extremely reactionary people have always said, that you can't get rid of private property, religion, and the state, because they're always with us. They're sort of immovable features of the human condition, and that is actually, you know, the argument. Or that they kind of say, well, how did we get stuck? But actually, if we read the book, they're pretty much saying we were always stuck. They can't explain how we were never stuck. There's no image of what it means not to be stuck, except that disasters happen, catastrophes happen, empires fall.
It sounds more like that we were stuck for the first 150,000 years and then got unstuck as soon as we got hierarchy.
Yes, that is sort of their argument. They say that they sort of say we were stuck until we had a hierarchy, and then the hierarchy they mentioned in the Upper Paleolithic is moving between a seasonal extremes, like a summer kinship structure and a winter one, the seasonal variations of the Eskimo idea, and then for reasons which really very, very murky, and they don't hardly even attempt to explain, even that seasonal pendulum slowed down and went dead, and ever since then we've been completely stuck. But they don't seem to be sure whether we got completely stuck in the 17th century or 12,000 years ago.
We've got some lovely comments in the threads here. What Daniel wanted to say something about Bohm. Daniel, do you want to talk about Daniel Bitten? That is, do you want to say something a bit more about Bohm, or chuck something in?
I don't know if I have anything besides what I just said in the chat. Just that you guys had mentioned, I think they left out his most important insight was the human revolution. Like, they focus on the deliberate consciousness of egalitarian foragers, but they left out that the way we became human, according to Bohm, and that's the main insight of his, well, one of the big insights of his book, is that we became human by this revolution, by killing off the alpha males and the bullies. And of course, Bohm doesn't focus on any of the female coalitions or any of that. He takes Bohm also takes male dominance for granted for some reason. He shouldn't have. It was already in 2000, I think, he wrote this book. It's a bit late for that, but still, the whole point of his book is that we became Homo sapiens by killing off the alpha males as a result of various things, including having invented weapons. And they sort of left that out because that sort of implies that there are sort of material reasons for why we did that. But, that's about it.
Yeah, it's a very strangely male perspective, the reverse dominance perspective of Bohm. Very focused on the fact that men possess weapons, and therefore anyone who's obnoxious and dominant has to go to sleep sometime, and therefore they'll be vulnerable to others with weapons. But of course, women, we're going to hear more about this revolution next week, but women can kill men without actually using weapons. All they need to do from an evolutionary perspective is say no to sex, and as long as they can back that up, they don't actually have to kill anyone. They just refuse. and the males have kind of got to change their ways, so that Bohm was not able very successfully to find real examples of what he termed reverse dominance. All of them were extreme examples which only happen very rarely of actual executions in hunting and gathering societies. They don't happen frequently, but there are many, many examples of reverse dominance in action in ritual life, which are usually toing and froing between the sexes. So women will be coming out with their ritual, men will be coming back with their ritual. And this is a kind of reversing the reversals, constantly happening. And it's a part of life. With singing, with dancing, with raucous enjoyment. It's a part of life that's fun and delicious and makes life worth living. It's not all about blood and execution. And for some reason, just Bohm didn't know about it. Well, it's quite easy to understand why he didn't think about it. He didn't know about it. But we've got many new ethnographies that are showing us this reverse dominance in action.
And the funny thing with Boehm is that he did know about sex when it was chimpanzees, and mentioned it a lot. And as soon as it comes to humans, better not talk about sex in case I get into trouble. And so you have a unisex idea. You have this coalition of reverse dominance coalition against the alpha males. And yes, I mean, you're right. You assume it's other males with their weapons. But it doesn't, you know, this reverse dominance coalition is kind of vacuous, it's empty, but it matters which, you know, who's suffering from the alpha males and who's most likely to lead that resistance. And I don't think from a Darwinian point of view there's any shadow of doubt it would be the females who'd have to lead that resistance for their revolution to have any staying power, to be more than just a sort of palace coup with one bunch of males replacing another. If one bunch of males replace one, yeah. Sorry.
Female sexual selection is just a staple of Darwinian theory, and in every animal that we ever study, it's such a staple. But it's funny because when it comes to humans, we tend to not think about that. All of a sudden, it's the guys sort of driving everything for, you know, obvious cultural prejudice reasons. But it's huge. It's funny that he missed that because I'm sure he knows about it in every other animal.
Yeah.
It's going back to Darwin and these coy females waiting to be captured and captivated by males. It's like Darwin himself just kind of got a Victorian drawing room model instead of observing all the sexual selection amongst all the other species with females making their choices. Suddenly reverts back to the Victorian ideology. You know. And Christopher Burns doing about the same. Cooper, can you tell us about Venezuela and the matricentrism from Venezuela? Because there's a lovely comment there. I don't know if you can talk. No. It's about the Venezuelan matricentrism with the maternal grandmothers and the matricentric unit of maternal grandmothers and daughters, but of course at odds with a very patriarchal society going on around it. So you get these kind of nuggets of female resistance to the sort of general overview of the society. It would be nice to hear more of that. The work of Alejandro Moreno there. It would be nice to hear more about that. There's so much of this evident in many cultures across the world that we assume there is a patriarchal tendency, but actually within that there may be a much more subtle, much more evidence for female coalitions as kind of the units of resistance or places for female solidarity, and very necessary resistance often.
Tam Dean Burns got his hand up, I noticed.
Tam, go for it. Go on, Tam.
Yes, okay, just unmuting. Thanks very much. Hugely illuminating talk, as ever. Lovely to be back. I think it's quite hard for us to think about engaging with that huge, weighty tome because there's so much else, good stuff that you've been introducing us to that deserves reading more, and especially because it doesn't seem like they're willing to engage in any form of debate or that either at all. They know of your existence, and Graeber took part in RAG talks apparently in the past. Oh, hold on, I've got to switch off an alarm. Yeah, sorry. But they don't give you any sort of, you know, respect. If there was an opportunity to really debate, as there should be, if they were interested in that, all well and good. But I'm going to concentrate on the good books that I found. And it's funny enough, I just found this little one today as well that I've not read. The Descent of the Child by Elaine Morgan. Yeah. Yeah.
Very good book.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
I don't believe everything.
No, of course not.
There's that the one thing that is the really solid bit of Elaine Morgan, not Lewis Henry, Elaine Morgan and August Koulioukas, is that wading would have would change the orientation of the pelvis to the bipedal orientation. That is the very solid part. But other parts of it are not maybe so solid. The thing about fat, the thing about sweat, the thing about hair, a lot of that may happen later. Brain, but I don't want to get into the argument because we've got enough difficult stuff to argue about without having to defend Elaine.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to ask whether, like Marshall Salad, I thought he was sort of well gone, but you said that he just died last year, and I just wondered, did he ever engage with you in any way, debate wise or that at all, or acknowledging what you were
the only email exchange I had with him was about 5 or 6 years ago when I was looking for a publisher for my book on Chomsky, and Sarnes was sort of I think it's called Prickly Pear Press, or one of those things which he was helping to. He was on the editorial board, and he asked. Yes, he was sort of considering it, and I don't know. He didn't seem all that particularly keen, but he was, I very much doubt whether he knew too much about what we're doing, but. At one point, it looked as if Silence would help me publish the book on Chomsky, but eventually I went back to the Yale University Press with it. So yes, I mean, the answer is no. And what is really strange is the recent collaboration between Silence and Graeber. I mean, I showed you some of those passages from his wonderful article in 1960, and then he just gone completely full circle, as if okay, we can't win these ones. They're right, we're going to take over the biology. We can't defeat them. So we're just going to have to back down and do purely cultural anthropology without any biology at all. And then even worse, in the last few years, Camilla and I were at one of his lectures, I think in 2016 or something. He says that hunter-gatherers have kings. They have monarchy. So hunter-gatherers have kings. And you sort of say, well, what? He says, yes, they have guardian spirits of the animals. And he said, well, why are they kings? Oh, because kings wield supernatural power, and the guardian spirits of the animals, they wield supernatural power. So they're kings. So he's saying, yeah, but are you saying that are you saying a picture of a stick is the same as a stick? I thought a stick you could really threaten people with, but waving a picture of a stick doesn't really do anything to anybody. It's a picture. But the argument which Sarnes and Graeber argue, they support, is that, well, if you believe in the guardian spirits of the animals, these are the animals which say, if you kill a bear and abuse it, or some other animal, and you'll never hunt again, or the various things will go wrong because the spirit is angry with you because you cut the meat the wrong way, or you're selfish or whatever. If you believe in all that, then it's just as real for you as a real king who's got real weapons and sticks to beat you up with. So there's no such thing as an egalitarian society, because you'll find some kind of forest spirit in the societies. And of course, the really irritating thing is that when you think about it, those forest spirits tend to be precisely the spirits of resistance. They're precisely the things which uphold the morality, and they come precisely from resistance to brute force and alpha male dominance. That's the idea that all religion is top-down brutality is just so, I don't know, it's astonishing. But there you are, that's their view. Any kind of religion, any kind of belief that some things are sacred is, according to this book, again, is the belief that private property is sacred. If you think some things are sacred, well, if you own your own car and you can keep everyone else out of the car because it's your car, then that's the car is sacred, and they actually, there's a long argument towards the end of the book. If a mountain is sacred to some great spirit, it's private property. And you're thinking, well, I thought it was the other way around. That if the indigenous people say this mountain belongs to the great spirit, you shouldn't privatize it. You shouldn't start digging it up with the aluminium company or extractive industries. I thought these spirits were actually resisting private property. But no, apparently it is private property, because private property is the essence of religion. So I don't know. It's just absolutely upside down nonsense, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And it seems to be that what I've picked up so far is all about that humans are only human when they're rebelling. And so that makes it difficult for them to consider a whole period where there wasn't a need for rebellion, except, on the sort of monthly cycle, the idea of pendulum of power and communism in motion that Mona talks about. But yeah,
well, that's again, there's no idea that authority can come from below. Well, every time we've had a picket line at UCL or anywhere else, David Graeber, was always on the picket line. There's absolutely, and of course the picket line is a huge non-violent authority. You don't want to be a scab. You don't cheat on your brothers and sisters. It's a picket line. And it's everybody who's been in a trade union will know what it is. It's authority from below. It's not coming from the boss. It's coming from below. But outside actually standing on a picket line and getting that, in terms of theory, there's no concept that authority from below makes any sense. So that, as you say, Tan, they're always sort of against authority. To me, I'm happy to be against authority, anti-authoritarian. But I mean, when the authority is coming from below, it's like, various things are just not allowed. Certain kinds of violence, certain kinds of sexual abuse, or I don't know. These days, deciding that you don't have to worry about COVID. You can just, go around without a mask and infect other people, or smoke in children's faces, puff the smoke of tobacco in their lungs. Certain things, there's a feeling from below that they're just not acceptable forms of behaviour, and that's a form of authority. So I don't understand it. And again, it's like rather like with ritual. There's so much of anthropology, including Pierre Bourdieu. They always think rituals are like coronations. They're always sort of soldiers marching up and down outside Buckingham Palace. They're always top down things. Ritual authority is always top down. No, it can be bottom up. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, the really powerful rituals are always bottom up.
Yeah.
Have we got any more questions people want to put in? Because otherwise we can wrap it up for this evening. And hope you come back to hear about the revolution next Tuesday. Anybody else would like to chip in? We're going to be. I think we've just about had enough for this evening then. So yeah, next week Chris is going to continue with blood, magic, synchrony, and cycles. I hope Ian Watts will be there as well to help with talking about the African ochre record, which is really the stuff that got left out from Graeber and Wengro's book. So we will hear more about how this revolution worked, how we think this revolution worked in creating the human species and creating modern humans. Yeah, I hope lots of you will make it back next week.
Okay.
So that's
See you
enough
then.
tonight.
So, okay.
Right, many thanks for coming from everywhere, all over the world.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
All right, everybody.
See you, Ian. See you, everybody. Yeah.
Bye.